episode 110 of Strange Brow Radio. I'm your host again, Tobe Johnson, and thank you to the members over at patreon.com/Strange Brow Radio that may be getting this particular audio transmission early, and over at Feral by Aaron, E-R-Y-N is how you spell that. Alchemy Sound Tools, let her know that you heard about Feral by Aaron here at Strange Brow Radio, and there will be a goodie put in your box. What's better than goodies in a box? All right, next up, we are going back to Maury Island with someone who's dug in deep and scratched more than the surface, such as I have. I'll tell you more about this particular writer in a second. We'll be right back. All right, here we go again. Thanks again for joining me for episode 110, trucking along here episode by episode. At the time I was recording this, I was heading down towards the Almoon Lab area here, bringing back my son actually up here to Washington, where spring break is, well, it's a kid's favorite time of year, really, besides Christmas and summer vacation. He'll be graduating at the end of this year here, so I guess every year will be a summer vacation. Oh, the reality check that he will have based upon that comment. I wanted to bring up a few things here. First of all, if you're not downloading or watching any of the Strange Brow Radio stuff, I'm going to promote some other stuff. Go check out the channel Third Phase of Moon with the two brothers there, the cousin brothers out of Hawaii. Every day they put up some interesting stuff on there from viewers that send them videos, mainly of UFO stuff, mostly of UFO stuff. And the last one was pretty interesting, that they had of over 60 monoliths that were discovered on Antarctica around 2012, 2014, 16. And then they suddenly disappear. Now these are very tall, lined up, look to be man-made structures lined up in the Arctic snow off the seaboard there. Really interesting stuff that they do every day. That was the last interesting one. I would suggest subscribing to that channel there. It's a lot of fun to do that. Also, the new strange stroll that I did at Maury Island at the Slag Forest is up, which will bring us to our guest today. But I did want to announce, and if you're a member listening to this episode early, then you know by now that the strange stroll number 5 is up. And you can vote. The poll closes on Easter Sunday. I believe that's April 4th. And until then, you have, I think, well over 9 different items that you can vote on for me to bring. And including in the choices to where I go are the 2 choices of Northern State Asylum, the condemned asylum that I've been to once and had a run-in with a haunted nail. If you're a member, maybe you know more about that than just the regular listeners. Sending me back there, and there's some interesting choices for you to pick along with this as well. Or you could send me to Forks, Washington, the twilight home of werewolves and vampires. So if you want to send me out to Forks, that's an option as well. So one or two of those choices, pick one of them. Poll closes April 4th, Easter Sunday, and then there's you can pick the top 3 things as well on the poll that you'd like to see me bring along. The last episode I did was, almost an hour long. Trying to whittle these episodes down to a half hour or less here seems harder and harder to do, but I got to find a way to do it because it's a lot to edit through. And most people, if you go through the actual analytics of it all, are tuning into all these videos for less than a half hour. So I'm going to try to keep this under a half hour. Wish me luck on that. Going back to where we just were, if you watched and listened, you saw that the patrons got extra psionics color night vision footage of me walking through a special park. In fact, I think I even released the name of the park to the patrons. This case here, we're going on a deeper dive with someone who researched this, a lawyer out of West Seattle. His name's Steve Edmiston, and he is the main screenwriter behind the 2014 film, The Maury Island Incident, directed by Scott Schaefer. So Steve and I go deeper and scratch more than the surface, like I did with the story, the real story and the real circumstances, which some of these details I did not know. Because when you watch a movie, you're not quite sure what is a writer's, narrative choice taking over the actual facts. But as a lawyer, an attorney, Steve knew the right buttons to push to get the real scoop on what happened at Maury Island. And right now, I'm leaning towards there was something way more interesting going on than a copper smelting plume dropping off slag over the island. It's a weird coincidence. We get into that, but take a listen to my guest here, Steve Edmondson, the screenwriter of the Maury Island Incident. All right, my guest tonight here on Strange Brow Radio is the main writer behind the Maury Island Incident, Steve Edmiston. Hello, Steve.
Oh, hello, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Now, Steve, we've got a lot to get through here and a limited amount of time to do it, but as far as the research behind Maury Island, the film, which came out in 2014, people can download that. Now you can actually watch a really good sizzle reel or commercial or promo for it on YouTube. It gets into a lot of the rumored lore and connected tissue of the paranormal, with Maury Island as just being a small little island in the Puget Sound connected off of Vashon Island, a place that I'm really familiar with because it's less than 20 minutes from my back door here. But tell us everything that you found out and take us to the beginning of how you were approached to even write about Maury Island. Sure. And let's start from there.
Okay, well, I think both those questions are great because there's definitely an origin story for how I got involved in this. And then there's the sort of how do we attack it? How do we do the research? How do we figure out, what's factual about this story? How I got involved is I actually live across from Maury Island. My house, if I flip this camera around and we open the shades and we looked out over Puget Sound, it's Maury Island. It's the East Bay of Maury Island. That's the view. And I have lived here in this area generally since 1987. So how many, it's 30 years plus. And it wasn't until 2012, living here, looking at Maury Island, that I had ever heard this story, that I'd ever heard the Maury Island Incident. Now, I didn't travel. I'm not I would say, if Scott Schaefer, the director of our movie, and I stand up on a stage, the first guy that says, I'm not a UFO guy. I didn't come from that perspective. It was the story that caught my interest. I was in a coffee shop in 2012, and I just watched Ken Burns' documentary on prohibition. So I'll give you a very precise origin story. And I was in a coffee shop talking with someone, and what was interesting about that discussion was one of the incidents that was talked about in the documentary happened 100 yards from my house. The final arrest of the Northwest bootlegging king, Roy Olmsted. And the pilings, I never knew, the pilings in our neighborhood, the old pilings from an old dock that's no longer there, like the pilings you see all over Puget Sound. That's where he was arrested. Didn't know it. I see this documentary. I'm like, I've lived here 30 years. How could you not know that story? We're having that discussion in a coffee shop. And somebody I don't know is listening and turns and says, you must know the Maury Island Incident story. And I'm like, no. And he goes, oh, yeah, like in the 1950s, UFOs and whatever. And, we were arrogant SOBs. And my neighbor and I, who were having the discussion, were kind of like, yeah, thanks, buddy. Yeah, sure, whatever. UFOs, woo. But I went home and, dialed up Wikipedia and a couple other things. And I went, whoa, this story is amazing. I mean, I don't know if it's true. I don't know if it's not true, but it's amazing. And it's kind of our story, just like this bootleggers. I go, what do I live in Stephen King's, what is it, Castle Rock? All these little stories. If I just dug, I would know these crazy stories are here. So I dug into the Maury Island story, and the more I learned about it, as maybe you did or others, the more it struck me as a very stunning story for all kinds of reasons. One of which is this notion that it's a hoax. That's really important for us to talk about at some point tonight. But there's tons of other elements of the story that are innately true, that are not in dispute, that make it one of the most extraordinary stories. I'm a screenwriter. That's my hobby. I'm a lawyer by day and a screenwriter by night, and have been for decades. And it was the story of Maury Island that struck me as a writer, in a sense that when I get up on stage with Scott, I often say, I don't know what's true. I mean, the first question we get in Q&A, do you believe it happened? Do you believe that, Harold Dahl saw 6 flying discs on June 21, 1947? And I go, Scott says, I think something happened for sure. And I say, I'm the skeptic. But this story, no matter what the truth is, what we know was true is so extraordinary. That's why we had to tell the story. The unequivocally true circumstance surrounding this was so good. So what happened was, in our neighborhood, we are kind of a really close-knit community. And my neighbor and I immediately thought this was a great excuse for a party and a community event. This was, let's hijack the story that we'd never heard before, claim that we've always been celebrating it, and have an annual June 21 party celebrating the June 21, 1947 Maury Island Incident. And we've been doing that now for, I guess next year will be the 10th anniversary. The very first year we started burning a saucer at the end of the party. It's now called Burning Saucer, and this party has become kind of nationally renowned. I mean, we're Ripley's Believe It or Not did a story on us. Den of Geek did a story. We've been labeled the birthday party of the Men in Black, and we'll talk about the story. But this party started it, and at the very first party, Scott Schaefer came up to me and said, that's one of the most amazing stories I've ever heard. That's a movie. And I didn't know this. He said, I'm a director. I'm a DGA union member director. We should make this movie. So that was how we got into making a film. I'm a writer. He's a director. We love the story. That's how we kind of, levered into, we're going to make this movie. And that's what kicked into the research.
And if anybody wants to see this Burning Saucer, you can check it out on YouTube. I think it comes up when you type in Maury Island Burning Saucer. And it was one of the real treats that I found. Nobody told me this was going on across the pond, but you guys all look like you're having way more fun than me. And so it's with that sense of levity, I think that I'll enjoy the rest of our conversation here. So Scott, in turn, asked you, we should make this movie. How long did it take from the inception, the invite, to actually head out there and start looking at things?
Once Scott said he was in, we're both kind of experienced in the indie film world. And so, we were pretty sure that the big lift for making a feature, and the movie that we're talking about is a narrative. It's not a documentary. It's a narrative. It's actors who play the roles, and you got J. Edgar Hoover, and you got Harold Dahl, and you got FBI agents, and so it's a narrative. But we also were aware that it was a big lift to make a feature, and so we agreed that we could tell a piece of the story in a hopefully satisfying way in around 30 minutes, sort of in a more episodic nature. And once we figured that out, we went into development, and I wrote a script that ended up being pretty much what we shot. I mean, we went through development, we went through this and that, but we ended up shooting that. The real issue in filmmaking, as you probably know, is money. Can you raise the funds? And you've seen the film, so this isn't, hopefully doesn't look like a film that was shot, on your iPhone with no lighting. I mean, this is a real film that when you watch it, whether you like it or not, it should feel like if I walked into a theater, at least the production values match what I would expect to see. It's, we wanted high production values. So we needed to raise some money. And so really in the development phase with a short film script, we really went out and said, can we raise enough money to make a film of the quality that we want to make? And we were, I've done a lot of raising money for films. I've worked with a lot of clients as a lawyer, as an entertainment lawyer, raising money for films. And, the tactic we took is we thought, this is a local story. Can we have a community discover the story in the same way that we discovered the story, be excited about the story, and promote the story? So in a sense, it was almost like thinking about crowdfunding, but on a micro basis. Will your crowd, if they feel it's their story, really jump in? And we had we rented out a very small theater in Burien called the Tin Room Theater. And we didn't have a trailer, but we had a slide deck that you would normally expect to see if you were going to look at a film. And we had a wonderful, it was just packed. It holds 50, but it was like, 65. That's a, big crowd in the Tin Room. And it was just marvelous. People were so excited to hear the story that they didn't know either. They hadn't heard it, but it's in their backyard. They were excited about it. And we raised the budget that night, and I'd love to say that it's always that easy. It's not, but in this particular instance, we raised the film budget. A big part of that was our executive producer, John White, who was a prince during this whole process. He was so excited about the story. So once we had the money, as is typical, indie filmmaking abhors a vacuum, so if the money comes in and fills the vacuum, it's time to go. And so we ramped up pretty quickly at that point, once we had that and were able to go into production. We shot the film over 4 days. So it's a 30-minute film. It was shot in 4 days. We didn't know what we had necessarily, but when it came out, the film was really well received in a lot of different ways. In some ways we did not expect. There was already interest because of, there's obviously an audience in the world of science fiction and ufology and paranormal. So there's a built-in audience. But one thing we didn't realize was the tact we took was so historically driven. We really focused on what's the history, what are the things we know about the investigation of the sighting that are so fascinating. And so we've got, we speak at historical societies. We were the keynote at the Washington State Historical Museum when they did their big annual event, because people love this sort of edgy history. They're really buying into the history component. We world premiered the film at the Big Island Film Festival in Hawaii, and that's probably not a place to sell a film, not that you're going to sell a short film, but it's a great place if you make a film, obviously, to go to Hawaii and enjoy a premiere.
Right.
Our North America premiere was here in Seattle at SIFF. We kind of played all over the country after that. And what's interesting about this content, and I think this is an evolution in indie film world, is because there's an audience that really wants to see it, packaging it as a 30-minute film and a talk is a really nice event. So we get called upon a lot to kind of come in. I usually do a talk at the front end to set a scene, so to speak, of what we're about to see. We watch a 30-minute film, and then by that point, the audience is, hopefully minds blown, and they've got questions, and it's it's a really, really entertaining Q&A, for about a 75-minute program. And we've done it at, and there's really great venues if you do that. I mean, if you want to show a feature, that's hard to show a feature. People have to sit for 2 hours. It's just a different environment. But when you sort of package it with it's going to be a lot of interpersonal engagement and then a piece of content that's exciting, we found it really successful. We have done the programs at the McMenamins chain, for example, because they do history pubs. They love that. It's been really interesting how easy it is to share and how it has just gone on. I mean, we are in 2021. And, except for COVID, which kind of shut everything down, we just get scheduled out to do this programming, which is exciting because it's a fun story. So that's the film. You probably have.
Well, yeah, let's talk about
what the story is.
You said you usually set the scene. Let's pretend this is a McMenamins. The audience is gearing up for your take. And then we'll talk about some questions I have here. So what do we know? Let's separate this into, Joe Friday facts, and then let's get into the speculation and the gray area here. So go ahead.
Well, when I give the talk, the first thing I do is spoil it for everybody. I just say, look, here's the story. If you went to Wikipedia before you came here tonight, here was the story. June 21, 1947, a guy named Harold Dahl goes out on his boat with his son, Charles. He picks up 2 crewmen in Tacoma that are unidentified in history. So we know we got 4 people on this 50-foot boat. And the purpose of their excursion in South Puget Sound is to pick up logs. They're out, and at that area, you had the big log booms going north and south, and logs would get lost. It's kind of like a cattle drive, and you've got a cow that gets lost, and you got to go round it up. Well, private people like Harold Dahl and his boat would go chase this stuff, collect it, and then sell it back to the mills. So it was just a way to earn some money. That's why they're out on Puget Sound that day. They go about 3 miles north of Tacoma, and they end up just off Maury Island, which is connected to Vashon, as you've mentioned. So today they're kind of a contiguous thing. Historically, they were not. And there was a fill put in between the islands. So they're just off Maury Island in what we call the East Bay. So, if you're on the beach on the East Bay of Maury Island, if you got there when you cruised and you looked to the east, you'd see Mount Rainier, right? Which is kind of interesting when you think about 3 days after our sighting, we have Ken Arnold's sighting in 1947 at Mount Rainier, how close those areas are. So Harold Dahl's off. It's about 2 o'clock. The conditions are fair. And here's the story. He sees 6 flying discs. They're shaped like donuts. One of them is lower than the others. It probably comes to down around 500 feet. And so they're on this boat. They're watching these 6 flying discs in the sky. The one that's down below appears that it's failing. Something's wrong with it. It's unlike the others. Then a chaff type. I always think of it when I read about this. I think, it's like you burn newspaper in a bonfire and it's floating like chaff. I imagine that's what they're talking about. A chaff is falling off, which is, I guess, interesting. And then it gets less interesting and goes into kind of Private Ryan, because there's an explosion and they talk about raining fire from this thing they're seeing in the sky. They talk about it as slag, as almost like a molten lava. And this is where, as a writer, when I read the documents that we have, and they're so I don't want to say boring, they're factual. Like if you look at FBI records, we'll talk about what we have. You look at the documents, you have to fill in the blanks as a writer, right? I mean, if somebody is so frightened of molten lava that's falling on their boat that they will run the boat aground, which is what they did, to get out from this raining fire and hide in the cliffs at Maury Island. As a writer, I was like, that's Private Ryan. That's like I got to get cover for this. That's exciting. It doesn't come through when you read the documents, but you have to think about, well, what does that mean, really? So Charles, the son, who I think was 13 years old at the time, on the boat, he gets a burn on his arm. They had the family dog on the boat. It's killed from the raining fire. They run the boat aground, they hide in the cliffs and wait, and all 6 objects, whatever they were, leave. They're gone. So the 4 individuals get back on the boat, on the beach, push it up, get on the boat, go home, and basically agree not to talk about it. That's the story. So it might end there. We would never have heard a thing. What happens the next day, allegedly, is Harold gets a knock on his door. And it's a gentleman at very early hour. Harold lives in Tacoma. Gentleman is dressed and described as wearing a black suit, black hat, black tie, white shirt, black shoes. Epitome of what we would today call the Men in Black. Okay. Now, he didn't say Men in Black, but we have a description. This is the first time we've heard in our sort of modern ufology of this phenomenon, Men in Black. True, not true, who knows, right? But first time someone told that story. Men in Black tells Harold that we have to talk about what you saw on the water yesterday. They go to a diner, they have a talk. The Man in Black proceeds to describe to Harold everything that happened to Harold on the water the day before and says, you better not tell anybody because bad things could happen. And that sort of encapsulates, that's the spoiler. You now know everything that you're likely to learn about the Maury Island incident, with one exception. If you go and you look online and you look at older information, you're going to find out at some point Harold Dahl confessed it was all a hoax. And so we should just forget about it. And that's where, as a researcher, it got interesting. Because when we dug into this story, so that's where we start. We start off with, we spoil it. We tell you, that's the story. You know everything. If you're bored, go home. You know, it spoiled it for you. You don't have to stay. But if you want to know more, what we did and what I led on in the project was, what we knew was there was an extensive record of this of an investigation by the United States Army, by the FBI. And the reason for the investigation of the Maury Island incident was that in August of 1947, the Army Air Force sent 2 intelligence officers to interview Harold Dahl and others about this incident. And today we might think, that sounds kind of nuts. You know, does the Army really, you know, somebody sees something and do we really take it this seriously? But you have to go back in time, because in 1947, we were 2 years out of World War II. In May of 1987, in May, Harry Truman, the president, had announced the containment doctrine, had let the world know that we were now essentially in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. And in fact, we were just simply afraid of what might be flying over our country. Maybe they weren't worried about little green men, but they were worried about people seeing things in the sky. So in the summer of 1947, when people reported sightings, there was actually a jurisdictional battle between our government agencies, the Army, the Air Force, the newly formed CIA, the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, all wanting jurisdiction over who was responsible for finding out what people were seeing. And they all thought much of it might be hysteria. It was a very popular phenomenon that summer, that people would say they saw things and try to get it in the newspaper. But there was some worry that some of it might be true. So you actually can go back and research newspapers and get a lot of information about this sort of pop culture that was going on at the time. What's interesting is the 2 gentlemen, the 2 Air Force officers that were assigned by the Army to investigate the Maury Island incident specifically, this is before Harold ever said it was a hoax, met with Harold at the Winthrop Hotel in Tacoma. They met with Harold on July 31 of 1947. Actually, they went to the hotel, and at the time they got there, there were a number of individuals that we could talk about that were there and conducted interviews, and they actually were provided alleged samples of the slag that we talked about that fell down from these objects. They took, after the interviews, they took the slag with them. They went back to McCord Field in Tacoma, and they actually got on a B-25 bomber, of all things. You can just say, they're flying a B-25 bomber. Well, apparently it was, you know, a lot of B-25 bombers. They were the Uber, apparently, of the Army in that era, because they were pilots that used to be, you know, pilots in World War II, and they knew how to fly B-25s, and there's probably a lot of B-25s around, and that's how they commuted. So they got back on their B-25 bomber, and they took off on August 1 in the middle of the night, like around 1:30 in the middle of the night on August 1. And the reason they took off in the middle of the night was actually August 1 of 1947 is the day that the Air Force separated formally from the Army. It's called Air Force Day. First day that there was a separate thing called the Air Force in the United States. They were going to be Air Force, and they wanted to go back to the celebrations that were going to occur in San Diego, which is why they were like, let's get on the plane, let's get home. Flight makes it about 45 minutes into the flight. They take the slag, they put it on, they manifested it, they put it in the navigator's kit, they take off, they make it 45 minutes. and the plane spontaneously catches fire and crashes in the deep forest east of Kelso, Washington. And the two Air Force intelligence officers, Captain William Davidson and Lieutenant Frank Brown, perish in that crash. And then it sort of gets all X-Filey if it doesn't feel like that right now. Remember they have the slag, they have this, and they actually call it top secret cargo when they manifest it into the bomber's navigator's kit. The site is immediately sealed off. They fly a platoon in from McCord to seal it off from local authorities. They get another intelligence officer to come onto the crash site, and they keep it sealed until they can find, and this is in the Army's report on the crash, until they can find the top secret cargo that's in the navigator's kit. And once that's found and recovered, and that intelligence officer leaves the site, then they turn the site over to local authorities. We have never heard what happened to that top secret cargo that was taken off, but it is in the Army's record of how that crash site was managed. The joke in our talk is always at that point that it's sitting next to the Ark of the Covenant with Indiana Jones, anything else that we just sort of hide away.
Right.
So that is, a horrific event. And I don't know in ufology, because I'm not a ufologist, I'm not an expert on the entire history, but the notion that 2 servicemen died in the context of an investigation of a UFO struck me as a writer as extraordinary. And the notion that they were carrying something that they had actually manifested as top secret cargo, and there wasn't an explanation for the spontaneous combustion of the plane, which, by the way, was reported in the Tacoma Tribune the next day as being shot down by a 20-millimeter cannon. So if you're a conspiracy theorist, if you're an X-File buff, all of a sudden as a writer, I'm going, oh, wow, there's a lot of story here. No matter what Harold actually saw in the sky, there's a lot of story and a lot of drama here around the Maury Island incident. So I was excited to sort of try to tell that story. Now, how do I drill into it? And that's where maybe my background as a lawyer was helpful. I did a lot of public records requests and spent a lot of time anybody can go to the vault, the so-called the vault, which these FBI maintains and some other agencies, and was able to discover and where our facts came from as filmmakers, as a writer, and Scott as the director. Our facts for this story came from FBI documents. So when we reviewed the FBI who had jurisdiction over the plane crash, the investigation. So imagine Agent Mulder is an FBI agent at a field office in Tacoma, and he's assigned a B-25 bomber crash in 1947. And as he's trying to figure out what happened, they have to figure out why was it there? What was it doing? What did it pick up? Why were they flying out that night? And so the entire Maury Island incident story, everything that we've talked about already today, is in that investigation file. So I didn't make this up. I'm relaying to you, and we relayed in our movie to our viewers, a narrative that is supported by the interviews conducted by the FBI agent, a man named Jack Wilcox, who, we continually and sort of jokingly refer to as our Fox Mulder. He was the agent assigned by the FBI to investigate this. And that's where all this information comes from. It gets weird when you look at these records and realize that J. Edgar Hoover himself was excited about this case. And it's not so much this case as it is UFOs in general. I think for 2 reasons. One, we could all, if we know enough about J. Edgar Hoover, he's a strange man. A lot of, interesting, quirky things about him, and he was just getting up to speed on his second big battle with communism. He was starting COINTELPRO, and he was going to start investigating, celebrities and getting scoop on everybody. It was but it turned out that one of the things that apparently fascinated him were UFOs. And so during the summer of 1947, he's involved personally. His memoranda with his signature on them, to and from director of the FBI, are what we relied on. And to me, it was just stunning, because one is, it's the power play. You just see Hoover battling with the Army and others over jurisdiction, which is fascinating. And then secondarily, the fact that he's just into the story. And ultimately in our movie, if you watch the movie, he's kind of a key character, and as a writer, it was a blast to write dialogue for J. Edgar Hoover. Who gets to do that? That was incredibly fun, to try to sort of imagine a scene where we won't have that dialogue, but we have to fill it in, right? The scene between J. Edgar Hoover and an FBI field officer on a subject that is near and dear to Hoover's heart, and use that scene to sort of to explain, the problems with, the whole investigation of the Maury Island incident, and what we will ultimately may never know. What did Harold see? My conclusion and sort of my thesis on the whole episode, from the FBI documents, from Jack Wilcox's own words, his own words, his own words to J. Edgar Hoover. I feel like the most important document in the whole case is an August 14, 1947 memo from Jack Wilcox, the lowly field agent in the gulag of the FBI. How you can't get farther from the FBI power center than to be in Tacoma, Washington in 1947, right? Think about it, right? I mean, that's as far away as you can get. So that he is telling J. Edgar Hoover directly, within hours after J. Edgar Hoover was misunderstanding and thought that Harold Dahl had confessed to a hoax, Jack Wilcox sends a teletype to J. Edgar Hoover and says, that is not true. Harold Dahl never confessed to a hoax. What Harold Dahl said was, I feel like I'm in so much trouble. I feel that I've been so ridiculed that now I'm going to invent a new story, which is I made it up. I'd rather be a liar than have to stand on, saying what I saw was truthful. So it's his confession is actually what's untrue. It's a little bit twisted that way, but it's fascinating because that is verbatim what Jack Wilcox told J. Edgar Hoover. Little denouement on the whole thing was a great story out of the Seattle Post Intelligencer a few years back, where a reporter that we had talked to followed up with Jack Wilcox's children on the story and wrote two detailed articles. And the children said, well, we never talked to our dad about this particular case, but they were both adamant if our dad wrote something, it was truthful. Like he was a no BS individual his whole life, and he did not exaggerate, and he did not bend to power, which was really useful for us as storytellers. Can we rely on what Jack Wilcox wrote? And that was kind of a nice way of thinking about it. So hey, this is how I talk for 3 hours.
So
that's a big chunk of the story.
Real quick, Jack Wilcox here is a name that didn't come up in the cursory research I did before I went to the island, but I didn't want to get into the weeds of. I knew that you were married to the story in a way that would take me months to figure out before I got there. So I was like, well, I'll scratch the surface, and then I'll come back here to Steve or Scott. So looking back at Jack Wilcox in particular, you had a chance to reach out to their immediate family. Are they still local here, and do they still stand by their dad?
Well, yeah, I did not. The reporter, a reporter for the PI named Jake Ellison, who had done some interviews with us, tracked down the children, and then he did interviews with them. And those are pretty easy to find. Seattle PI, Jake Ellison. Jack Wilcox. You'd find it on Google.
Right. And these FOIA requests that you did personally, Steve, looking through the amount of paperwork that you got here, were you able to see Hoover's signature on any personal interest towards Maury? Was
Oh
there?
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
this is just for I have a short list. I have a big binder here, but my hot document list right there. I'm a lawyer, so this is how I think. I put everything in order. I get every piece of information, I put it in order, and try to figure out what the story is. And this, for example, is this is the August 14, 1947 teletype to the director of the FBI from Seattle office, from Jack Wilcox. And after this memo, on I believe August 17th and on August 27th, Jack Wilcox wrote 2 very lengthy memos to Hoover. And when Hoover's commenting, he's putting his initials on these documents. And if it's useful, I can, down the road, scan you something, and you can throw it up or whatever.
And what you had there in your right hand, that's your teletype portfolio on the case?
Yeah, this is the, I know.
Show everybody how thick that is. That's a pretty thick binder there. That's a lot of information.
This is the binder.
Okay. You got the big boy?
This is the binder.
Oh, okay, there's the big boy. Okay.
Those are the actual FBI and CIA Army documents that we.
And that whole binder there, that whole binder relates to Maury.
Yeah, that's my Maury Island research binder. So those documents only relate to Maury. Yeah.
And are you still compiling stuff privately? Has this caught your interest privately to where if you have any spare time, do you still look at this case?
I do. And what's interesting is, we would like to take, we get such a good reception to the half-hour story that we told. We had to do a lot of cheating, we laugh a lot, like, a feature film needs to open with, if you remember the movie Jaws, right? And Jaws opens with a young woman on a beach who gets killed by a shark. But there's a great great scene in that movie, the Spielberg, classic, where 2 old guys are on a dock, and they're throwing chum out because they think they're going to catch the shark. And all of a sudden, the chain gets pulled by the shark, pulls the dock in half. One of the guys is being pulled out to his death, and it's a crisis. But Scott and I were charmed by that, and we thought, if we do this feature, this movie has to open in the forest, east of Kelso, Washington, where these 2 old timers, maybe one's passed out by the bonfire. They're out there, who knows what they're doing. And you just see this burning something in the sky, and it just keeps getting closer and closer and closer and closer until finally the one guy's like, "Wake up, Charlie, wake up, wake up, wake up. We got to get out of it," because this B-25 bomber is going to just, crash where they are. And just sort of open with the plane crash, because the plane crash, in a sense, even though so much has already happened, the sighting, the earlier investigations, the things that the men in black said, and the things that happened to Harold, even though those have happened, the plane crash sort of sets in motion the X-Files, sets in motion the actual investigation that has created, what we now have as a record in this case. And sort of, so then the audience can then build back, what's the mystery, what was being discovered. So to your question about, do I still do this research? Yeah, because we'd love to do a feature. And so anything I come across that is useful, I like to glom onto and throw it into the binder. And I'll give you one example of something that was much more recent. This manila envelope, this is classic research stuff. And so this is a pretty thick, in fact, it's 67 pages. And I'll tell you why. You hit a deadline. I'm sure this is true for people that research this, or roadblock. You hit a roadblock. You sort of do your records request, you do your original research, and you're like, okay, how do I find more? Is there more? And one of the things we realized was that because UFOs is like, the number one public record request in history. Like if any agency would say, you get more requests, what's the most? Well, it's UFOs. It's crazy, but it's true, right? I mean, that's what people want to know. So what's happened is a lot of these agencies have done their research and they put it in a depository, everybody has access to it, and that's a good thing. But then you're sort of blocked. You're like, now where do I go? You know, did the agency put everything in there? Are they holding anything back? I don't know, but that's now our sandbox. So you start thinking, what's a different way to go at it? So I got an idea that I should go to the Army, because on July 31st, that B-25 bomber was an Army aircraft that crashed. Even though on August 1st, that would maybe become an Air Force. You know, I was like, who's got it? I need to find out. I need to ignore, I need to not use the word UFO or anything close to it. I need to have a records request that has nothing to do with that world, so it can't get dismissed. So I defined a records request to the Army that was specific to the crash of a B-25 bomber, you know, flight number. I had the information. I figured out where the archives were and said, that led to the death of these officers. I want that information. Didn't mention anything about why it was flying that night, just a really dry request. And then often, I'm sure those of you that have done this research will find months go by, you hear nothing, you assume maybe, I won't hear anything, you never know. And I got a phone call from an archive for the Army in Alabama, out of the blue, and they said, well, I don't think we have, I don't know if we have anything that'll be useful to you. All we have is a 67-page report about the crash. And I'm like, how do you not sound excited, right? You're trying to be cool and say, well, that might be useful. That might be interesting. Because that did not exist. Right. So in that moment in time, it was like Schrodinger's cat, it kind of exists and didn't exist. And until we saw it, it was like non-existent. So I get this file in the mail, this one in the mail a few days later. And, it's poignant. And it's like a lot when you get in, when you're dealing with facts and people that died, it moves from sort of speculation and fun into like this level of poignancy. I mean, this is a file about two men that died in service to their country. It was their assignment to investigate this assignment, and it has all kinds of interesting information. It doesn't have a whole lot on Maury Island because this is the crash site investigation itself, this piece, but it had one document that I find haunting. And it's a map that's hand-drawn of the crash site. And it has kind of remarkable, it's just sort of somebody's, so you got to get in your head, somebody is walking in a forest, in the summer of 1947 where a B-25 has crashed, and they're making notations on a map about, here's half of the pilot's body. Here's, and you just stop your sort of excitement about the underlying subject matter, and you realize this is a narrative of kind of a horrific event, no matter how you slice it. Those are the two first deaths in the history of the Air Force. If you think, they're actually the first two deaths of an Air Force or Air Force personnel in history, because that was the first day of the Air Force. August 1, 1947. But that I guess is the long-winded answer to your question. Do I still get information that I find interesting if I can? Yes, the answer is yes. Someday I hope that some relatively elderly person will contact me and say, I was on the beach at Maury Island and I saw something, some sort of corroboration of what Harold thought.
Because going to Maury Island, you would never know that there was rumored crash retrieval. There was an incident at all. Vashon, the same, which is pretty much just Maury Island proper. It's just, connected by a little spit. But there really is no appreciation for an event. So when I found out you were doing something across the Puget Sound in recognition, I was like, well, here it is. And then I found out that there was actually, kind of a tongue-in-cheek city council, response to this, and everybody was there with their tinfoil hats saying, you know, we honor Maury Island. But in short, and just making this video that I did, there really was no mention, no appreciation. Now, I did end up asking some of the people in town what their experience with Maury Island was, if they knew about it. And this is some of the stuff I wanted to talk to you about, was the response from the people about Maury Island and slag, molten slag in particular, immediately went to a copper smelting mill across over in Tacoma. So tell people about the Asarco copper smelting mill and how that may or may not be connected to the story.
So the Tacoma, Washington had a fairly infamous smelter that would, I guess, process various metals and into other types of various metals. I'm no expert in that area. Those of us that grew up in this area, there used to be a running joke of the Aroma of Tacoma, which was essentially the off-gassing from the Asarco smelter that literally created a fairly foul smell back in the days when we didn't care so much about what we threw up into the sky. My early iteration as a lawyer, I did a lot of Superfund cleanup work, litigation, and Asarco is one of the most notorious polluted sites, was one of the most notorious polluted sites, certainly in the state of Washington, because of the arsenic and other, harmful properties of the metals that they were processing. So there is a theory that if Harold was 3 miles away on Maury Island and wanted to create a fiction that he was finding some sort of strange material on the island, or that he was struck by strange material that hardened, and he acquired this material and used it as part of an elaborate hoax, it must have been, smelter detritus from Asarco. I think that has been one running sort of theme in terms of the skeptic community, of which I'm a member of the skeptic community, that this could have been that. I've seen some documentation. People think that tests that were run on materials that, it's got so many layers. I'm a lawyer, and so once you get to about 3 layers of hearsay, I'm like, so somebody said somebody was tested and nobody has the documentation of, I find that equally difficult to put much weight in. I'm
sorry to interrupt, Steve, but my surprise was at the people that lived in Maury Island that didn't have an appreciation or know about this incident. They only knew that the town had sections of the forest cornered off because of arsenic poisoning. So that's where our conversation would start. And I was surprised to hear people say, no, I've never heard of it. I've lived here my whole life. I know about Asarco. So somehow, some way, the story is being discredited, whether or not it's true or not, because the town has taken credit for arsenic poisoning and not given it to any other. I mean, it's a weird coincidence to the point where it kind of pushed me back, like, oh, so if you're looking at this initially and you hear about there being any connection to contamination from a mill, it really does not sell you on the story of the hard facts of, Jack Wilcox or the bomber crash, any of that stuff. You can't get there with this mill kind of looming, downwind from Maury Island. So what else have you found out?
Well, on that subject, just I'll share something about that. So the entire area of Puget Sound, including my city of Des Moines, anywhere within the plume of the Asarco smelter has arsenic poisoning, arsenic contamination in the soil. In the city of SeaTac, they actually give parents scrubbing brushes so they can scrub the fingernails of their children, once they're done playing in the dirt, because you're going to have exposure to arsenic that is not being remediated, to the degree that they're remediating in Tacoma itself, you know, when they have the beautiful new Ruston development there where it's all been remediated and everything. So I'm not, the fact that there are sites on Maury Island that were in the plume and have contamination, that doesn't bother me. That to me, that's a non-issue. I'm not saying Harold didn't make it, you know, that somehow Harold didn't take some actual slag from the smelter and use it as his sample if he's hoaxing. I guess that's possible. I think but for me, the reason that people don't know about this, and we talk about this when we give a talk, one of the very early things we talk about is, you know, I created this graphic of the spectrum of belief or disbelief. And, you know, sort of as we go through and we talk about, things that are, you know, known scientific facts, you know, gravity would be on one end. We would say, you know what, I think we have enough study of this phenomenon that we are accepting it. It's at the end of the spectrum of belief that pretty much everybody buys into, pretty much. And then if we go to the other end, we start getting into things that we may have a debate about climate change, I guess. I know where I land on it, but in any event, there are people out there that disagree. Maybe we're not quite at the, you know, gravity place there. But you start moving away from it and you start getting into really interesting areas like Bigfoot or, life after death or ghosts or things like that. And you say, well, I'm not sure you've proven it to me, but the problem I have is I can't disprove it either. So we're in this middle ground, which is great for storytelling. I mean, it's great. It's a great place to study and to think. But if you go to the farthest end on the other side, where someone confesses to a hoax, now we don't want to spend any time with it, right? If someone says, I made it all up, that goes into the dustbin of history. Why would we spend another minute thinking about Harold Dahl if he said, I made it all up? And so what I think would happen, this is my theory, I think the FBI was delighted to close cases in 1947. Somebody saw something, I got to investigate it. What happened? I know what it was. It wasn't this thing. I'll close the case. So when Harold Dahl was going to change his story and say, well, I'm not, you can read the final reports from Jack Wilcox and you'll say, Harold never confessed that he made it up. He's just saying that's the new story he's going to tell. He's writing 13-page memos to J. Edgar Hoover saying precisely that. The FBI was fine with that. That met their needs. It was like, we'll close it. At that point, what happens? We have a guy that says it's a hoax and records that go under seal for 50 years. So why doesn't anybody know about this story? Guy says it's a hoax in 1947, no records to be researched. Who's going to question it? So it isn't until, late 1990s that someone could even ask for records relating to Maury Island, if they thought to do so. I think personally, the reason people don't know the story is it's never been allowed to breathe in the sense that Roswell was, or even Ken Arnold sighting at Mount Rainier. It's never entered that middle ground of, I don't know what happened, but it can't be disproven because of the story that Harold created that said it was a hoax. My mission as a storyteller is to pop that balloon. I'm like, I don't know what Harold saw, but to suggest we shouldn't pay attention to this in the same way that we pay attention to Roswell and Ken Arnold sighting and so many others, that's not right, because Harold never recanted to the FBI.
And just to go with your point here, Steve, is Bob Lazar said the same thing. He's on record saying that he wishes people didn't believe his story about S4 and back engineering and element 115. Steve Pierce, friend and fellow logger of Travis Walton, I think was offered a sum of money to recount the Travis Walton incident as well, and damn near, I think, took him up on it because it was a healthy chunk of change. But the motives behind these guys are pure. I mean, Steve Pierce and all the loggers there, of course, passed lie detector tests. Bob Lazar's story completely checks out to the point where his graduation at Los Alamos, or whether or not graduation, but his employment at Los Alamos, I think, has been verified now via phone book. Going with Jack Wilcox here, by what you're saying, there really is no better agent for us to lean on and say the hard facts, no matter what Dahl had to say about recounting it. We have a field agent with the FBI that was testifying to the president about this.
And I mean, exactly. I mean, his job's on the line, and I feel it's one of the most extraordinary. That's why in the movie, if you watch our movie, we open with our fictional version of Jack Wilcox in J. Edgar Hoover's office, and we close there in our 30-minute movie. And we are imagining, taking these documents, these conversations that took place in documents, and kind of moving them to a conclusory meeting in Hoover's office. And, Wilcox did not say to J. Edgar Hoover in many, many, many pages of reporting that, in fact, Harold Dahl ever confessed to this, and he kept correcting the director of the FBI. That August 14th memo is amazing to me for that reason, because Hoover had just said, "Oh, it looks like this is a hoax." And imagine I don't know if it's courage or obstinance. You're a lowly field agent in Tacoma, Washington, and within 3 hours of the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover, saying, "We're closing this case as a hoax," you write him a teletype and tell him he's wrong. I mean, who knows what Harold saw? But for me, that ends the notion that this was a confessed hoax. It's something else.
And Harold's not the only witness that is tested. Steve, sorry to interrupt, but Harold's not the only one to testify to this. His son, right, as well. I mean, how old was Charles Dahl when he saw the craft with his father?
Well, I think he was 13. And, we often get follow-up questions on Charles. There was a sister in the family. And so it's natural to say, well, what did they say? And one of the issues that comes up frequently is, well, Charles, we have no corroboration. Nobody in the family, sort of came out and said that their dad saw something. And what's funny to me is, as a writer, one of the tropes in Hollywood is the family secret, right? I mean, it's like one of the most common storylines there is. And so what people get frustrated by, well, if Charles didn't come out later and say that his dad really saw something, or if his sister didn't come out and say his dad really saw something, that proves dad didn't see something. And if there's a family secret that the family's supposed to keep, what were those kids supposed to say? Right? So was dad made a decision, no one's going to know that he saw anything. He wants it to be his story, his hoax. So to me, it's very consistent, because my understanding is that that the kids never really talked about it. There's an interview, if you dig deep, there is a lot of discussion online about a single interview that Charles gave later in his life, and he's passed away. I think he moved to Louisiana. And in this discussion, online, people are saying, aha, Charles said it never happened. It never happened. So therefore, it's a hoax. And then if you go deeper in the trail online, finally, the reporter that was the one that conducted the interview these guys are talking about says, no, Charles never said that. He never said his dad, he never said this didn't happen and my dad made it up. So the reporter even denied that. I suspect this is, we had, let me answer it with another little mini story. One of the cool things that happened after our movie is the city of Burien launched a UFO festival and ran that for a few years. And so we would be, not surprisingly, frequent guests, local story, tell the story, show the film. One year, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on her name, Harold Dahl's daughter, who was elderly, came to the festival. Wasn't invited. All of a sudden she's there with like her grandniece who's escorting her. And, wants to meet us. Apparently thought it was great that we're telling the story. And Scott, I was kind of shell shocked, like, this is, wow, we want to dive in. And Scott basically point blank asked her that, well, did you ever talk to your father about she's come to the Maury Island Incident, UFO festival. So she's here for a reason. And Scott said, did you ever talk to your father about, what he saw? And she just looked at Scott and just kind of gave a really sweet smile and said, I didn't really know my father. And that's all I can say. So, and that's it. That's all we had from her. And she didn't really want to get into it, but for whatever reason, she thought it was pretty neat. She knew what our story was and our interpretation, which was he actually saw something and decided not to tell about it. And then she came to the UFO festival. I don't know. I don't know what it means. It was a wonderful moment, a sweet moment. I don't know.
No, that's why I often remind people when there's a live event, whether or not you want to see the guest that's there, whether or not you're going to make it late or early, coming to these live events, there are these happy accidents, these moments that you can't get on podcast or pre-edited, shows. It takes going to these live events. And that's the real bummer about all this COVID stuff, is that people are really missing out on some incredible moments like that you're having there. The Maury Island Incident is something that people can download where, if they want to get a hold of it. How do they get a hold of it?
Super easy. MauryIslandIncident.com. That's our film website, MauryIslandIncident.com. And there's a click link to a Vimeo where you can rent it for $1.99 or something like that, or own it for, less than Wonder Woman cost when it got out.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty easy.
I want to ask you next here, Steve, regarding, because I know your time's short, regarding your own personal experiences. You live in I imagine a vista of sorts. If you can see Maury Island, you probably have a good water shot as well. We see stuff here. I know UFOs are real. They don't seem to all be traditionally propelled. There's this organic quality to a lot of the UFO sightings that we've been privy to and that I've taken reports of. Where do you stand on UFOs, and what have you seen?
Well, I've not seen anything that I would say struck me as a UFO, but to me that is it's like it doesn't matter. I know that, there are many, many things that exist that I will never see, and I don't doubt their existence. So to me, the seeing, for me as a prerequisite, seeing it myself, not an issue. I feel that the math is such, well, it just, to me, it just strikes me as such ridiculous arrogance that we would be the only forms of life, whether they end up at a spacecraft or whether they're microbes on a planet or whatever. I mean, the notion that we're alone, that somehow we're the ones that figured this out and became what we are, and there's not anything else, that to me just, I don't buy that at all. I squarely come down on the side of having an extraordinarily open mind, and hopefully someday some, nifty thing will happen and we'll all just say, oh, okay, that changes everything, and we have to shift the paradigm. But I haven't seen anything.
No. Well, has looking at the Maury Island Incident changed the type of reading that you're doing? I mean, are you leaning into looking into, things that are going on with the To the Stars Academy, or the big release that happened in 2017 with the data dump that we're looking into UFOs? Are you looking at this evidence?
I'm spending, I sort of have a, I come at it from a storytelling perspective. And so I'm looking for great stories, and I find that I'm in the middle of a podcast interview, and I've got a 3-month-old Springer Spaniel jumping in my lap right now. So that's kind of funny.
Yeah, I was asking you whether or not you were leaning into
Oh.
looking at the evidence that was available now.
I think from the perspective of diving in to other stories in this world, I'm super interested in how do I bring some great stories to life. I mean, sort of coming at it from a writer and a screenwriter's perspective first. So, I appreciate that some people have a much broader scope of what they're interested in. But for me, like what I have been spending more time on is, really what was happening in this period of history. So, while, I was at a McMinnville UFO festival, I guess last one they probably had before COVID. And the pilot that, saw was the witness, the flyer, the Tic Tac UFO incident speaking is fat. I love it. But that's not, that's not my micro history. My micro history is I'd like to tell a Northwest story. If I could take Maury Island at a half-hour film, if I could have Ken Arnold's story as a half-hour film, if I could have the McMinnville, sighting and photographs I think there's so much. And so this story is so rich in the Pacific Northwest, and that I feel is so underserved. And part of that's competitive. I'm like, what the hell, Roswell? What? We have so much going on up here. If this, to me, so it's like, I'm a little bit, that's where I'm spending my time. And so I'm staying in that sort of historical world as far as storytelling and my own investigation. And I'm like I deal with concrete, you know what I mean? I'm like, that's why it worked for me to do Maury Island, because I was able to get into, historical documents. I think that's possible because of the tremendous record generated around the Mount Rainier sighting by Ken Arnold. I think the same thing's true in McMinnville. I mean, I think, how fun would it be to make a feature film called The Summer of the Saucers? Because that's such a rich period of history that is, like the individual stories themselves, other than Roswell, undertold, really undertold. And there's some great stuff. So that's where I lean in, is in that historical stuff. Now, if somebody called me and said, I'm going to hire you to write a feature film screenplay and it needs to be a modern one, I'm like, well, when do I start? Sure. But, I'm finding, and maybe it's an age thing, but I got to focus. I got to focus.
Yeah, absolutely. Our guest today, Steve Edmiston, the film, The Maury Island Incident. Hey, thanks for coming on air and dispelling some of the scuttlebutt out about this, in particular the stuff that I dug up. I knew I only scratched the surface, and I still feel like even after talking to you, we're all still kind of scratching the surface here, which is fascinating. But being a local to Maury Island and a neighbor to you, maybe we'll cross paths someday on Maury and, come to more conclusions on the beachhead.
We should go walk that beach. It's a great place to hang out and think about what happened there or didn't, and how close Mount Rainier is. That stuns me. So thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It was fun.
All right, that was Steve Edmiston, neighbor to Maury Island, and myself. So maybe that's not the end of our journey with Steve. We'll see. It doesn't sound like he's done with the story by any means. In fact, if they're doing a yearly burning of the saucer festival, there may be more and more demand here if we can find some room and time to do it, like all good things. Remember, if you'd like to support the show, by golly, you're already doing it at Patreon. Over at patreon.com/strangebrowradio is a way to do that. Or you can shoot me an email if you'd like to be a guest or have your story read live on air. I'd be happy to do that, anonymous or a name attached, whatever you like. I hope you guys enjoyed the psionics footage. I know that for the extended viewers, they got a little bit of shaky footage here while I was walking through the forest. And I think there was a couple of editing errors that made it onto YouTube as well. So Anyway, we're always upgrading here, looking at new products that we can get, including editing software, which I think is going to be the next big expense, as well as a laptop, because this MacBook Pro, where I do the mainstay of my work, is getting up there, almost a decade old, but it's still trucking along. All right, we'll be back next week, probably with some field audio from Oregon that I'll play for the members and whatnot. And so get ready for that. I know we're saying goodbye to some people that were down that way. I'll tell you more about that later. And, of course, the documentary, The Flash of Beauty, A Bigfoot Revealed, will be coming out this year, as well as the Al Moon documentary that I'm putting out. There's also one other thing coming out here I'll tell you about on the next episode, May 1st and 2nd, that you can be a part of as well, that has to do with Forgotten Cultures and Power Spots. That will be a weekend free conference. I'll tell you more about that. Next week, we have a great new guest, incredible stories. As I said, we are going down the Lichen Highway here, the Werewolf Highway, Dogman Highway for a bit. I want to give that a definite, more than cursory peek at. So we're going to talk a little bit about witnesses that see dogmen. That's it for me. Have a great weekend or week whenever you catch this episode. And of course, I will see you in the trees.
Oh.